Well, it's a delight to be here. When I come to a Canadian study conference, which I've actually come to almost all of them, I know more people in a study conference here than I would if I go to a USMB study conference, even though I've lived there about 1 or 2 years longer than I've lived in Canada. And that's partly because you have more study conferences, but it's partly because there's just so many people that I've learned to know and love over the years. You've been my fellow students, or you've been my students, or you've been fellow pastors in Canada, and just lots of different connections. So it's always a joy to come and be with you. So I'm pretty Canadian at heart. There's some places where I say that loudly and clearly, and some places where I choose not to. But now that it's Blue Jays versus Ohtani, I know where my loyalties are on that one. So, and it's not in California. So glad to be here and glad to share the USMB story. As I share the story, it may very well be that some of you sitting here are saying, why did you do it? You should never have done it. Here are all the reasons why it was a really bad idea. Feel very free also to express those viewpoints. I've faced them all before and since we made that change. But for the most part, I'm going to be presenting our process and our results in the U.S. in a pretty positive light because I experienced it very positively. And I will also be leaning on an article that was written that documented the whole process by Geddert, and his assessment is maybe even more positive than mine would have been. So I'm going to lean on his affirmations at a couple of places for what we did in the U.S. So that's the plan. I have a PowerPoint for almost everything. It's not because you need to see it all and hear it all, but in case you want to take notes by snapping pictures, that's really convenient, but it also helps keep me on track. So what did we do in the U.S. with Article 13? The article that I'm going to be making reference to occasionally and quoting a couple of times was called Article 13 of the USMB Confession of Faith, a study of confessional revision, written by a student at the time at Trinity Western, I believe, or at Seminary, Geddert, published in Direction Journal in 2019. So if it's really eloquent at a couple of points, it's probably because I'm quoting Geddert. The MBs have had 4 confessions of faith over their 100 and whatever it is, 65-year history, I guess it is. So the first one, when they were first established in 1860 in the Ukraine, they simply adopted a confession of faith that was already in use by the Mennonites in the Ukrainian colonies. It was actually only 7 years old at the time, or at least the revision that they used. It was the West Prussian Mennonite Church Confession. I am very unfamiliar with that one. I became much more familiar with the one that was first created by the Mennonite Brethren, and that was in 1902. A completely new confession of faith written in North America by North American Mennonite Brethren in the General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. For those of you in a younger generation, when I say General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches, that's confusing language for some people. It has nothing to do with what used to be called the General Conference Mennonite Church. It has to do with the fact that the U.S. and Canadian conferences also had an overarching conference called the General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. And that was the body that was pretty much leading and guiding the entire confessional process and many other things. Many different boards and projects of the Mennonite Brethren were jointly done by Canadian and Americans. Actually, before it was Canadian and Americans, it was 4 districts. It was the Pacific District, that was pretty much just California at the time. The Southern District, which was Kansas and surrounding states. The Central District, which was North Dakota and surrounding states, and the Northern District, which is Canada. So Canada wasn't a national conference, but neither was the U.S. There were 4 districts in the General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. At some point, I don't know the exact year, somebody probably here does know that, national conferences were also formed, and I'm telling you the story because it's very relevant to confessional processes. The Northern District became the Canadian Conference, and this mother organization spawned a bunch of kids. British Columbia Conference, Alberta Conference. But the Northern District existed before the kids came around. In the U.S., it was backwards. The districts existed first, and then they invented a parent. Okay? We had the Pacific District, Southern District, Central District. Well, we actually should have somebody who takes care of us and keeps us together and calls family gatherings, so let's invent a parent, and so they created the U.S. Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. The opposite processes still has implications today, long after that happened. And that is that the Canadian Conference has a much, much stronger, more stable, more long-lasting parent with sometimes fledgling children. And the U.S. has robust adult children, and we sometimes don't know what to do with our parent. Okay, and I see the chair of the board I'm on in the U.S. nodding in approval, and I think that's often been the case. So when it comes to confessional revision, it makes a lot more sense in Canada to start with the Canadian Conference and then see if they can persuade the provinces, or maybe get the children's opinion before the parents make a decision. In the U.S., there was a lot of work that was being done at the district level. In fact, in some ways, there was more negotiating that needed to happen between districts before the parents could make a decision. So all of that is, I think, relevant to what's going on. So that was a digression from my slides. But 1902, the General Conference created a Confession of Faith. In 1975, a new one was created. Some of you know who Dr. David Ewart was a leading teacher in the MB Conference for many years. He's my uncle as well, so I knew him personally and his family. And he has told us, when I was his student, he says it's a really good thing that we didn't have any confessional revision between 1902 and 1975, because if we had, we would be an entrenched dispensational denomination. And we just barely escaped that fate. That would be his viewpoint, okay? So if you're a dispensationalist, David Ewart is part of your undoing in this conference. In case you know that story. In 1999, the General Conference was in a long process of revising the Confession of Faith, and then they rushed it to its completion because it was being disbanded. The General Conference was being disbanded, was in the process. And so articles were created and revised over a period of many years, and then the last 4 or 5 or 6 really quickly before the conference went away. So that's a much longer story. Some of you have lots of strong feelings about that story as well. And then in 2014, we revised Article 13 in the United States. So I'm going to aim to tell that story as coherently and as fairly as I know how to do it. I was a part of the whole process all along the way. I was one of the founding members of the USMB Board of Faith and Life in 2008. So that's another part of this difference between Canada and the U.S. Canada had a thriving Board of Faith and Life. I think it was called that the whole time while there was still a General Conference of MB churches, and without any glitch, just kept right on working when the General Conference disbanded. The U.S. did not. They had a small group that worked a little before the dissolution, and we didn't have one for 6 years because the parents just weren't quite ready to be parents, I guess, to the grown-up children. I don't know if you like my metaphor, but that's what I'm using. So, what happened? Geddert Weeb helpfully, and I adjusted some of his claims, but I'm borrowing from them as well, named a series of external challenges that led to the revision, and then a series of internal challenges. And as you'll see, the internal are responses to the external, and sometimes they're quite identical. So what is it that led to revision of Article 13? MBs were colony people in the Ukraine, and they became colony people in Canada and the United States. But eventually, there's a move to the city, there's a move to larger towns, and you get increasing contact with Christians who don't see things the same way that you do. And new ideas that, I mean, when I was growing up in the 1950s in Hepburn, our worldview was really clear. MBs are the ones who got all the theology correct. All the other Mennonite groups got most of the theology correct. And then the Lutherans had a little less, and eventually it was completely wrong. But like, I mean, we just were so sure that whatever we had always been taught and always believed and all our ancestors had lived and died for was exactly what the Bible teaches. Well, what happens when you come in contact with people who are just as serious followers of Jesus and just as diligent students of Scripture, and they don't agree with you? And that was happening more and more, I'm sure, in Canada, but certainly also in the United States. Mennonite Brethren had been in the United States in fairly large numbers pretty much a generation before that was the case in Canada. And that will also have accelerated some of these external, I should have called them influences or threats or challenges. Along with that became a growing indifference to historical identity. I've been interviewed quite often in Fresno by undergraduates who found out that I was an immigrant. Okay, I grew up in Canada, I moved to the United States, and one of the professors there said, I want you to interview an immigrant and ask all these questions. And every year I agreed to do it for at least one student, so I didn't take up my whole semester being interviewed. But every time I did this interview, it occurred to me more and more and more, I'm a first-generation immigrant to the United States. But I'm a second-generation immigrant to Canada. And my immigrant experience in Canada shaped me more than my immigrant experience in the United States has. We were a very isolated village in Hepburn in the 1950s. I mean, we got it all right, and the next ones have it almost right. That's just the ethos of our village. That's what immigrant people do. But as you move to the next generation and the next generation, and my parents stopped speaking German just when I turned 2, so I had to learn German as an adult. You change language, you change cultural identity, and so on. And the historical identity becomes less and less and less important. The phenomenon. Pretty strong attraction in the United States to fundamentalism. And the 1950s and 60s were kind of the heyday of a very kind of militant fundamentalism, which remains to this day quite a bit stronger than you would find it in Canada in many ways. The inerrancy debates of the 1970s and early 80s became very divisive, especially in some of the environments where I was a seminary student in 1976. And so, if I can say, distracted by controversies that took the focus away from other issues that for at least many people would have been considered even more important. In the adoption of, I should make just the word Christian in quotes, maybe Christian patriotism, where God and country are just tied together in a way that in some ways mirrors the Christendom of earlier eras, but in some ways is also different from that. It's not that the culture automatically experiences or imagines itself to be a Christian culture. It's that the Christians think that they should take over the culture. And that kind of Christian patriotism has always been stronger in the United States, and that was a growing influence within the Mennonite Brethren Church. This is how Weeb describes it, Weeb's article. Their deep love, this is they, the USMBs, their deep love of country, along with the common belief that America is or ought to be a Christian nation, meant most evangelicals were ready to defend America with their lives and to enlist in the armed forces whenever asked to. Rooted in a civil religion that celebrated American exceptionalism, which many U.S. Christians still have difficulty separating from their Christian beliefs, evangelical patriots honored the sacrifices of U.S. servicemen and women with as much reverence as devout Christians observe Good Friday. I snapped a picture while driving, so I didn't get a good enough picture to put it into the PowerPoint of a couple of bumper stickers that just God and country. You know, you have the flag and the cross and the service people and proud to serve the Lord. It's just a complete meshing of serving God and serving country. All of this influenced USMBs more than Canadians, I would say, but to a considerable degree over the decades. internal challenges that often mirror this. So, disunity because of diverse responses to the external factors. So when these external factors lead some MBs to believe and practice things that many other MBs believe is a betrayal of their historical and theological heritage, the unity is strained. And so you end up dealing with conflict and dealing with disunity and having reconciliation meetings instead of being the peace church. You're trying to regain some measure of peace. Growing lack of trust in the seminary and its biblical theological leadership. So when I was a student in the 70s, the seminary had fairly recently, before that, had made a massive shift away from Dallas Seminary dispensational, very conservative evangelical orientation. J.B. Taves was called in to be the new president. He pretty much replaced the entire faculty, mostly because all except one resigned when he came, and he hired a new faculty that were kind of 1960s radical Mennonite Anabaptists. For their day, they were radical Anabaptists. And that didn't go over well with parts of the U.S. conference, and so disunity, distrust, and that distrust hasn't always gone away, although I think we're in better shape now than we've been through much of our history. Growing indifference to Anabaptist identity, more and more churches erasing the name Mennonite from their church labels, not even necessarily because they were sure that was a good missionary strategy, but because they were embarrassed to be connected with the word Mennonite. And then I think the dissolution of the binational conference, the General Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches, played a significant role. Much larger leadership gap in the U.S. Than I think was the case in Canada, for the reasons that I've pointed out before. So a newly formed Board of Faith and Life, created in 2008, was given the function of being a guide on doctrine and the implementation of the confessional teachings within the local church. And it was an uphill battle because I think we were beleaguered by individualism and localism and multiple theological directions vying for identity in the conference, etc. So we changed the Confession of Faith. Now I'm going to first show you what we changed it to, and maybe just a comment or two on some of the factors, and then I'm going to talk about the process. How did we go about doing that? So the opening paragraph of the new one is virtually identical to the opening paragraph of the one that is currently your Confession of Faith. We changed about 2 or 3 words for stylistic reasons, but ours now says, "We believe that God in Christ reconciles people to himself and to one another, making peace through the cross. The church is the fellowship of redeemed people living by love. The bond between followers of Jesus transcends all racial, social, and national barriers." So especially those last few words are a crucial link to Article 12. Article 12 on church and state. And if our bonds to one another transcend national barriers, that's a transitional statement that's crucially important to being countercultural, especially in an American context. And so as we negotiated the wording of the new article, this was a big part of the discussion. To what extent do we wholeheartedly agree with Article 12? Because Article 12 is an essential foundation to Article 13. So only slightly reworded. Did I show the change of title? There we go. We were not enamored with the word non-resistance, even though it's been a key, Wehrlosigkeit would have been the German original of that, and it's been the translation often used in Matthew chapter 5. But for reasons that were already pointed out yesterday, it often is associated with just do nothing at all and just be the doormat on which people stomp their feet. Whereas Jesus is actually calling for a fairly active resistance that's nonviolent. And so non-resistance no longer communicates what it ought to communicate. Might not have been the right choice all along. And the whole gist of our revision is to make peacemaking into a much more positive statement about what we do rather than what we don't. And I'll talk more about that tonight. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a little bit of overlap to tonight. I just want to warn you of that because they asked me to include in my presentation tonight what the U.S. did in the revision of Article 13. So I'm supposed to redo there what I'm doing here, except now I have an hour and there I'm going to use maybe 8 minutes of my allotted time. So expect some review there. Okay, here's where it starts to change. So this is your version. I'm not going to read it for you. You're very familiar with your own version, I believe. But just to point out a couple of things, we believe that the evil and inhumane nature of violence, that's a strong statement in the older version, which doesn't take space to define what violence means. So the kind of violence that is being rejected here is evil and humane, as was pointed out yesterday morning by Ken. In the Old Testament, the word violence is actually used somewhat differently. So we were concerned about the miscommunication that could come from a statement like that, and then especially the question, in times of national conscription or war, we believe we are called to give alternative service where possible. For us, that was clearly the most challenging sentence for more than a few reasons. The main one was when it says we believe, this we is problematic in a denomination where we means 50% of us. Which 50% gets to say what we believe? If half of us believe it, do we say we believe it? Well, you could make a case that the we is the historical continuity. You could make a case that as long as it's the leaders and the preachers and the teachers and the district ministers, it's to be expected that our new converts haven't yet learned, or that people who've chosen to join us from other traditions haven't yet learned. I could live with 50%, if that was the 50%. But what if it's half the preachers, half the teachers, half the district ministers, half the conference leaders? Now we have a different problem. Who gets to say what we believe? And so the quote that you gave from I Changed My Mind is relevant there, because I was one of those who desperately wanted to retain in our confession of faith a statement that we do not participate in the military. But just because I believe that doesn't mean that I have a right to try to use my influence to convince a denomination that we should say we when it's not we. Yeah, so that was a huge issue. But beyond that, it really doesn't say what it needs to say if we want to say we don't participate in the military. I want you to think about that as a Canadian. When was the last national conscription in Canada? Was it Second World War or was it Korea? It was Second World War, right? Okay, so the first part of this, we believe that in times of national conscription, so it hasn't been relevant since 1945, that's 80 years ago, or war. When was the last time Canada was at war? Was that Afghanistan? For how long? 3 years? 8 or 9 years of Canada being at war. So 9 of the last 80 years, this has spoken to the reality of Canada. Now that's of course not what was intended. They intended to say, don't go and join the military. But it doesn't say that. It says, you shouldn't be in the military when there's national conscription and when there's a war. So it just doesn't quite say what it was intended to say. So we didn't like that part of it. But the we is the bigger problem. Okay, who's the we? This is what we've changed it to, and we'll talk about the process afterwards. We actively pursue peace and reconciliation in all relationships by following Christ's example and his command to love God, neighbors, and even enemies. We strive to be peacemakers and agents of reconciliation in families, churches, communities, in our nation, and throughout the world. As peacemakers, we alleviate suffering, reduce strife, promote justice, and work to end violence and war, that others may see a demonstration of Christ's love. Here's the crucially important sentence change. As in other peace churches, many of us choose not to participate in the military, but rather in alternative forms of service. And then the last sentence, I think, is identical to the previous version. Because Jesus is Lord, his example and teaching take priority over nationalism and the demands of human authorities. So in my presentation tonight, I'll be saying more about the convictions that are embodied in this statement. So before I talk about how we went about the process, maybe it would be a good time for the possibility of a question or two if you want to ask it now already. There'll be more chance later. Yeah. Yep. I mean, that's a huge challenge, I think, for everyone. The ones who have always leaned more towards what we might call the traditional Anabaptist peace church focus, and the ones who've leaned more towards an evangelical focus. Because now the polarization, which is just in everything, is also between those in the church. So how are we going to be at peace with the rest of the MBs who think that our way of being at peace is the wrong way of being at peace? I mean, if you want a clear example, what do you say on the Sunday morning after Charlie Kirk is murdered? What do you say? And we had pastors across our denomination who were, to say nothing is wrong, to say anything is wrong, to say this is wrong and to say that is wrong, because suddenly one person who many of us had actually never heard of before is a flashpoint for, are you on the right or the wrong side of a whole range of questions. Is your theology right or wrong? Is your politics right or wrong? Is your ethics right or wrong? Is your nationalism right or wrong? And on every question, there's always the one right and the one wrong. And if you take a stand on one question, I already know your answer to all the other questions. I mean, you said in this polarized world, I mean, this is the problem. So what does Article 13 do to that? I mean, I don't think anybody's going to look at that and say, oh, now I guess I'm going to stop being polarized. It doesn't, the statement doesn't solve anything, but I think a statement like this is an unpolarizing kind of statement. If we took it seriously, we would realize that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing with our aggressive rejection of everybody who disagrees with us. So I appreciate the question, but that's the best I can do. Sure. Yeah. 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 Right. I'll talk about that tonight too. You know, which comes first? Do we first believe what we believe and then we find the scriptures that support it, or do we first study the scriptures and then we come to a set of beliefs? It always goes back and forth. And you know, what are we most strongly influenced by? Is it our own experiences and our traditions? Are we most strongly influenced by our neighbors, by our preachers? Right. 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 And I mean, especially in Myanmar, the two poles that were presented, the Anabaptist response and the dominant one, And in the Ukraine, was it maybe a bit in between? Yeah. So these are challenging questions, and in some ways, to stand on the outside and cast aspersions on the choices that people make in the context in which they're wrestling with the tough questions is an awkward place to be as well. So we as preachers and teachers and theologians and Bible interpreters, we have a mission to discern and speak clearly, but we have an obligation to listen to the people in the trenches as well. So, yeah. And reconciliation. I don't remember the conversations about it, but I think reconciliation is, in a sense, is a title on its own. I mean, I suppose reconciliation is a subset of peacemaking. You could argue. But, yeah. Good question. I'm not sure if I know. All right. Let's go on a little bit, and then lots more questions if you want later on. So what led to that? So a lot of things preceded it. The external challenges, the internal challenges, and considerable amount of conversation. But more and more churches were literally or figuratively putting an asterisk beside Article 13. So if they did in fact use the confession of faith in the process of perhaps new members, classes, or something like that, although I suspect that the people who use the confession of faith are not the ones who are going to want to put an asterisk beside Article 13, and the ones who put an asterisk are the ones who didn't bother showing it to their new members as well, to some extent at least. But this was happening. You put an asterisk beside 13, and basically you just say, yes, this is also in there. A lot of us don't believe this. Let's just consider this one optional. It's great if you accept the other 17 articles of the Confession of Faith. This is part of our tradition. Don't worry about it too much. It's kind of what was going on with Article 13. Now, people who think it didn't say what it needed to say kind of feel a justification in doing that, but it has side effects. I mean, if you get to put your asterisk beside Article 13, how about if I put mine beside Article 10? Or whatever one you choose to put it. And so the integrity of our claim that we are a confessional people, and our ability to say anything at all about the fact that we expect people to, if not fully endorse, at least not undermine our confession of faith in all sorts of contexts, is seriously jeopardized when one of the articles is just, it's there, it's part of our tradition, don't worry about it. So that was a problem to be solved. We talked about this in Board of Faith and Life from its beginning in 2008, and seriously considered initiating a process of revising Article 13 for all the reasons that I've suggested so far. But these were the big questions. Who gets to decide what should be confessed? If the Board of Faith and Life can persuade the leadership board, and the two boards together can persuade enough delegates to accept something, does that mean that the denomination now agrees to it? I mean, that's the legal process. That's what the bylaws say we would be allowed to do. But who's the we? Who gets to decide what a confession of faith should say? Is the primary strategy that somebody decides it's our job to figure out to the best of our ability what the Bible teaches and what Jesus calls us to, and then we're going to do all we can do to persuade everybody else to believe what we believe is right? When I read your new preamble to the Confession of Faith in Canada, that sounds very much like the thinking behind it. We discern together what the Bible says, and from now on, it's not us asking you to agree with us, it's the Bible instructing you on what you ought to believe, and you don't get to argue with the Bible. Of course, that assumes that we've got the Bible figured out right, and that's where the big question is, who's the we when we disagree about that? So, if that does not work, don't we have to change the confession? If we can't persuade people to believe what it says, don't we have to stop saying this is what we believe? And that was, of course, the big question. Who's the we? Three themes were immediately listed as crucially important if we're going to talk about Article 13 publicly as a denomination. We need to work towards unity. The unity was fragile enough for reasons already mentioned. If we were now going to polarize over the result or the process, and usually when the result is not approved by some people, then there must have been something wrong with the process as well. If this is going to tear us apart, we are not making any progress on any important issue. We need a shared vision, and I think that post-dissolution of the General Conference, that was even more crucial in the United States. We had a church planting, Mission USA, at work, but we needed and always do need continued work at what is our shared vision. And authenticity matters. And this was what actually eventually changed my mind. I went into this as maybe the only one in the Board of Faith and Life who was really sure we should not change the confession. No, we are a peace church. We have always been a peace church. There has never, ever been any Mennonite or Anabaptist confession of faith, as far as we knew, anywhere in the world that didn't declare that we don't participate in the military. We in the United States are now going to start a process that removes it from our confession of faith. Who do we think we are? And plus, I'm a pacifist. I don't like the word, but the sentiment behind it is my own personal conviction. Why would I be in favor of helping with this process? But the authenticity question finally did me in. It's like, this isn't about me. Just because I believe something, we're not going to have a contest to see if we can get 51% people to believe it. We have to say something that we can say together. And I think that we can say this together. I suspect most Baptists would read that and say, I can say that too. Probably. Might say it a little different. Most Catholics would probably be able to say that. So it's not as though this is somehow a completely unique Anabaptist way of referring to peacemaking, but what it says is what we can agree Jesus calls us to. And so authenticity matters. We can't say we believe something that we don't actually believe. In 2010, we had a USMB convention in British Columbia. That surprises you. That's, of course, the only time we ever did that. But it was in conjunction with an anniversary celebration for many of you would have probably been there, of the 150th anniversary of the Mennonite Brethren. And so we had a lot of delegates going for that and said, we're going to have our USMB conference in British Columbia as well, which we did. And at that conference, we did a straw poll. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. Which articles in our confession of faith need conversation? And we actually asked two separate questions. Are we practicing what we preach? And do we actually all believe this? Well, as soon as you shift from, how do you practice what you preach, Article 1? Article 1 is about who is God. What does it mean to practice that? I mean, it's a faith statement. But there's plenty of statements in the confession of faith that are about what we practice and not just what we believe. We believe in a church should be like this, and spiritual gifts like this, and generosity like this. Well, that's when the question is, yes, we agree that we should be this. We're not doing such a great job. But you don't change your confession of faith because you fail to live up to its high calling. But maybe you do if you don't actually believe what it says. And so the only article on which there was very clear disunity was Article 13. We just don't all believe this. So, these two issues. We don't always practice what we preach, but yes. Yeah, the flashpoint was, yes, that was the main thing. It's not like people were saying we just don't like the title. That was not, nobody was arguing about that. Nobody was saying it's not really worded quite the way they meant it. That's not what they were saying either. The one question was, are we really going to tell the world that we as USMBs do not believe that Christians should be in the military, when in fact we know perfectly well that half our preachers are not saying that. Many of them are exactly saying the opposite. That many of our churches, many of them have flags, although that's a separate question. Many of them celebrate veterans with enthusiasm because they believe they were following Jesus' call to be peacemakers. And so the disunity of belief about whether we should or shouldn't be in the military was really the big issue, the biggest issue. At first, we looked at this issue and said, you know what, we can't change the confession of faith. It's not ours. It's a joint confession of faith between U.S. and Canada. And in my heart, I rejoiced because I said, well, we're going to propose a change to the confession of faith, and we're going to present it to our Canadian brothers and sisters who get to vote it down if they want to, because it's a joint confession of faith. And I'm pretty sure they're going to vote it down. So I guess I can play along with this for a while because I know it's not going to lead anywhere. Like, the Canadians are going to prevent us from doing the wrong thing. That was my inner attitude at the time in 2010. And then about the same time that we found out, well, actually that's not true. There's no general conference, so there is no body that can prevent us from doing whatever we want to do anyway. All it means is that we don't quite share a confession of faith after we start changing ours. So yes, we can, but that was right about the time when I also felt very strongly convicted that if my whole stance is, what tricks can I pull out of the bag to get everybody to stay with what I believe rather than what everyone else believes, is just really not only the wrong approach, but the wrong goal. So I became a wholehearted participant in the goal of making it say what we can actually confess together. Got quite a bit of critique from that from my Anabaptist friends in NCC, in Mennonite World Conference, in seminary, in my local church. Sometimes we have to do what seems right in our own eyes. So I changed my mind. Then we had a study conference in 2013 in Phoenix. Anybody in this room was present at it? I know about 15 Canadians joined us for that. There were 3 primary presenters. Roger Poppin, senior pastor, Bakersfield mostly, presented a case for legitimate protective violence, pretty much the traditional way that most evangelicals would interpret the Sermon on the Mount and other teachings of Jesus and other teachings in Romans 13 and elsewhere on why participation in police forces and military is not what Jesus was prohibiting, and so on. Dale Gray, professor at Tabor College at the time, presented the case for nonviolence. It's a good, strong presentation of a traditional Anabaptist understanding of the teaching of Jesus. And I was asked to make a presentation. I think they gave me the title, maybe I came up with the title, Radical Peacemaking. What do we do about the fact that half of us believe Roger Poppin is right and half of us believe that Dale Gray is right? And yet we're supposed to write a confession of faith and we're supposed to agree on what we say. And how can we be a people of peace in this particular disagreement? And what can we agree that Jesus calls us to? So that was the challenge that I was given. So instead of telling you how well I did or how badly I did, I'm going to let Geddert Weeb do that. So this is going to be quoting from his article. In Tim Geddert's article, he argued that whatever believers do, they should do because the lordship of Jesus justifies it. This truth cannot be overruled by any other authority. And in brackets, that's part of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Secondly, the 2 positions most commonly held by sincere Christians, that is, pacifism and limited use of violence for peacekeeping. The doctrine of just war, but not limited to that question. So the two positions are much closer to each other than to other options on the nonviolence violence spectrum of positions. So part of what I did in my presentation is I drew a spectrum. I said, okay, here's radical militarism for the sake of building the kingdom of God. And here's radical pacifism for the sake of world peace. Now, what do Christians actually believe when they're on different sides of the middle? What did Roger Popman actually defend? Did he defend that? Not even close. He defended something here. And Del Grey didn't defend that. He defended this. So Roger Popman and Del Grey are actually quite a lot closer together in their worldview, in their understanding of Scripture, even though they disagree, than either of them are to those people there. So what does that mean for us? Can we get along when we disagree on some really important questions? So that was my goal. Here's what Geddert said about it. He criticized, that's Tim Geddert did, criticized the easy identification of Christian values with American values and urged listeners to consider what kind of lives Christ calls them to. And he provocatively argued that both pacifism and limited peacekeeping violence are complex positions that allow for mutual respect between those who hold them. Within the USMB, pacifists and non-pacifists are not so far apart that unity and fellowship cannot continue. The crucial question, said Geddert, is how can we be deeply and passionately involved as peacemakers in our homes and churches and neighborhoods and cities as followers of the Prince of Peace? So that's what I aim to do in my presentation. That conference then led to a flurry of activity over the next at least 6 months. We surveyed everybody at the study conference, got all sorts of feedback and suggestions. We drafted open letters to the constituency. I don't know if I even mentioned, Christian leaders coming up. We drafted a new Article 13 version. We got lots of feedback. We revised the draft. Christian leader was actively, that's our American counterpart to MB Herald, actively informed and advocated for the initiatives that we were putting forward. We actively solicited lots of feedback from MCC, from ICOM, from Canadian Conference of MB Churches, the whole Faith and Life team. I think it was not called that yet, whatever it was called back then. And we had regional conversations all over the place with pastors, with Bible teachers, with district BFLs, et cetera, BFLs, Board of Faith and Life. And then we gathered for our convention in Santa Clara in 2014. We had breakout sessions in which we narrated the process that we went through, I don't know how to say that as a good Canadian, that led to the recommendation. We explained the recommendation. We got lots of feedback. And then we voted. And I couldn't find a record, but I remember it as 91% in favor. Of course, votes are anonymous, and I don't know exactly who voted against it, but I think there were people on both sides. There were people who said it doesn't distance ourselves from the peace church tradition enough, and there were those who said you just can't take that out of a confession of faith and call it Anabaptist or Mennonite. So a few people on each side didn't like the end product, but 91% is a pretty good consensus in a denomination that hasn't always found it easy to reach consensus on some tough questions. Follow-up, we committed ourselves to working towards greater awareness of our revised commitments, to create resources to promote active peacemaking practices, and I would say we were only marginally successful in doing that. If I remember correctly, when the Canadian MBs changed their position on women in ministry, was that in Langley or Abbotsford or wherever it was? No, it was in Calgary. In Calgary, I was there. There was also the same commitment. We're going to get to work creating resources, helping churches, and there was some regret later on that they probably hadn't done quite enough of that as well. And I think that's what just sometimes happens. We reach a milestone and we forget that there's follow-up that really is important as well. And maybe we could have done better, and so on. Here's a couple of concluding comments from Geddert Weeb, and then we still have almost a half an hour to just talk about, I think, whatever you want to talk about. Actually, I have about 5 slides, so if you don't want to take notes, take a bunch of pictures. Considering the pressure of American evangelical sentiments within the USMB, it is remarkable that the revised Article 13 substantially reaffirms an Anabaptist Christ-centeredness and the centrality of ethics and discipleship to its vision of Christian living. So Geddert Weeb at least was convinced, no, it does not explicitly say we stay out of the military, but it bases whatever it does say on all the right things, the way Anabaptists would do it. I think that's what he's claiming here. In restating those principles, it makes a relatively small concession to those who dissented from the pacifism of the 99 Confession and whose sense of disconnectedness from Article 13 originally triggered its review. So according to Geddert Weeb, we didn't really concede all that much, although I think not everybody would quite agree with you on that. In some ways, the new version of Article 13 is more Anabaptist than the 99 version and is more biblical as well. It refrains from a general condemnation of violence based on its effects, for which proof texts are difficult to find, and instead underscores, as early Anabaptists did, the centrality of Jesus' ethical teaching to living as faithful disciples of Christ. Moreover, the new article's explicit identification of the USMB with other peace churches places the conference squarely in the pacifist camp of Christianity. That, I think, is a little bit overly generous in its assessment, but we might not be squarely in the camp, but many of us are very much in the camp. Let's put it that way. In the same camp as Church of the Brethren, Society of Friends, Quakers, etc., many other varieties of Mennonites. It also underscores the claim that Jesus' example and teaching have a greater claim on the lives of disciples than any nation or human authority. And I'm going to come back to that issue tonight. 16th century Anabaptists would have approved. So Weeb claims, I see a few of you shaking your heads and saying, no, I don't think they would. Sorry. Anabaptism was also evident in the process that brought forth the revision. And I very much agree with that. For Anabaptist denominations, following Jesus is a communal exercise and experience. The USMB Board of Faith and Life followed their lead in mapping out the review process. Rather than leaving the revision to an elite group of church and academic leaders, the BFL engaged with as many participants as possible and over a considerable length of time. The conference communications and the district structures and leadership were essential in facilitating this far-reaching endeavor. For the USMB BFL, this approach was not merely pragmatic, but illustrative. It showed the MB membership and the world that this is how Anabaptists do things. 2 more slides. Even the tone of the process struck an Anabaptist note. The study conference demonstrated peacemaking, said the Christian leaders, Connie Faber. Faber was referring to the graciousness with which people treated each other despite serious differences of opinion. The BFL's gift for creating environments that made participants feel respected, even by those who disagreed with them, enabled the process to move toward a widely accepted resolution. I credit Larry Nickel with a lot of the genius behind shepherding the BFL and then the conference to a peacemaking process. He was our board chair. Developing a process and set of practices consistent with the beliefs under review not only validated the outcome, but also served the BFL's goal to raise the USMB's awareness that Jesus calls his disciples to be peacemakers. Okay, this is the last one. The broad support for the revised Article 13 is testimony to the wisdom in prayerful planning and to the BFL's commitment to Christ-like peacemaking all along the way. The price may turn out to be high, but despite the tremendous pressures to conform to American evangelical sensibilities, the USMB accepted a confessional article that is more strongly Anabaptist and more clearly grounded in the teaching of Jesus than the one it replaced. Now, if you are quite sure that an explicit statement about not participating in the military should be there in order for it to be Anabaptist, then you're going to disagree probably quite clearly with part of this assessment. But that's the end of what I plan to spew forth until you ask all sorts of questions. And feel very free to critique as much as ask any questions.